Crisis. Crackdown. Phony war. People's power. Deteriorating relations. On this edition of The Debate.
European Union's uncertainty.
Be a part of the show and send us your questions via Facebook, Twitter, or Viber. Don't miss The Debate, only on Press TV.
When it comes to the Brexit, the UK is being accused time and again of wanting its cake and eating it. Now, Germany has said that Britain will not be allowed to cherry-pick in its Brexit negotiations with the EU. Elsewhere in the EU, Italy has made news, but for the wrong reasons, at least where the EU is concerned. Prime Minister Matteo Renzi has resigned after a resounding no to consolidating the constitution. Add to that France's upcoming presidential elections and its contenders. Well, this edition of The Debate is all about Europe and its fragile future.
More than 5 months after Britain's voted to leave the European Union, the terms and conditions of the divorce, known as Brexit, remain shrouded in uncertainty. It is the exact kind of uncertainty that both the UK and the EU were warned about. In Britain, Prime Minister Theresa May is expected to trigger the formal Brexit negotiation process by the end of March 2017. But British lawmakers are complaining that they still don't know the government's plan for leaving the EU.
They are still actually sort of stuck in the headlights. They really don't know what's going to happen. This has not been considered through. The people in the Conservative Party who pushed Brexit did so for completely opportunistic reasons.
Up to 40 MPs from May's ruling Conservative Party are expected to back a motion from the opposition Labour Party which calls for clarity from the government over the issue. The Premier, however, says she's not going to unveil the details of her government's Brexit strategy since the move would undermine the UK's position in negotiations with the EU. The possible Tory revolt will take on added significance if the Prime Minister is forced to table a bill in Parliament for formally triggering the process of leaving the EU. In fact, such an impasse is quite possible. Britain's High Court has already ruled that MPs must have a vote on the mechanism. The government has launched an appeal to overturn the ruling. At the same time, Theresa May has come under pressure from the European Union to end the growing uncertainty. The bloc has warned that Britain will have less than 18 months to strike a deal to leave the bloc once the negotiations begin.
There will be less than 18 months to negotiate. Should the UK notify the Council by the end of March 17, as Prime Minister Theresa May said she would, it is safe to say that negotiations could start a few weeks later and an Article 50 agreement be reached by October 18.
Britain has also been warned that it will not be allowed to cherry-pick in its Brexit negotiations with the European Union.
We will not allow for cherry-picking. The 4 basic freedoms have to be kept. Free movement of people, goods, services and financial products. Only then can there be access to the common market. That has to be the rationale for negotiations with Great Britain.
European leaders, including Merkel, are desperately seeking to safeguard the unity and interests of the European Union following Brexit. Such a task, however, is becoming increasingly tough as the bloc is facing fresh crises, including the resignation of Italy's Prime Minister Matteo Renzi following his defeat in the country's referendum on constitutional reforms and the rise of a far-right candidate in the French presidential race. These are the latest in a string of electoral tests to send shockwaves through Europe's increasingly fragile foundations.
Our guest joining us for this edition of The Debate, political analyst and journalist Colmáin joins us from Paris. We have finance editor of The Independent, Sean O'Grady, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome. Sean O'Grady, I'll start with you. It just seems like Theresa May is not having an easy time with this Brexit. The latest on the news of Brexit, it seems to come through every 20 minutes as I'm looking here in the net. I mean, we're looking at a Supreme Court ruling, some of the highlights, Hammond and Davis saying that the UK should pay the EU to have access to the single market. Germany saying that Britain will not be allowed to cherry pick in its Brexit negotiations when it comes to the freedom of movement. What is going on exactly when it comes to the Brexit? Negotiations have not started yet, and you're getting all this news and drama.
Well, I think that I can update you a little bit more as well, because the latest development in Parliament, in the British Parliament, is that the opposition party, the Labour Party, has asked for to see the Brexit plan before the Article 50, before Britain says it applies formally to leave the European Union. And the government said that they weren't going to do that, and now the government has agreed with the opposition political party that it will indeed share this exit plan. So that's a new development that's happened today. And what's behind all of this? You're asking what's behind all of this. What's behind all of this is an anxiety on the part of many, many people in the governing party, in opposition political parties, and in the country as a whole about what is going to happen, and what is more, whether people are going to be able to have a say in what happens, whether Parliament will have a say in what happens, when and how Parliament or the people will have a vote on what's happening in the next 2 years or so as these negotiations go on. And there is an enormous amount of uncertainty about it. Inevitably there will be uncertainty about it, because it's not just up to the British about what happens, it's up to the Europeans about what eventually gets settled as well. And on top of that, as you were saying, there's a lot of change that may happen in Europe politically next year. We have elections in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, and maybe in Italy as well. So those are big, big changes that could happen next year, and they may change the way the European Union behaves and the Europeans' attitude towards the British. So there's a lot of things that could be happening in the next 12 months or so that could send the negotiations one way or the other. But what people in Britain, a lot of people in Britain, want to hear from the government is what their plan is, what their ideal idea of what they would want to see for Britain in the future.
Do you think that the people of Britain and Colmáin have the right to know what the plan is? And this goes in the face of what the UK Prime Minister Theresa May has said, is that, you know, if we were to reveal what and how we're going to go about the Brexit strategy, that this would damage UK's negotiating position.
Well, if Britain were a democracy, they certainly would have a right to know. But Britain isn't a democracy. There is no real democracy in Europe, in any of the nation states that form the European Union. Theoretically, of course, the British people have a right to know what their government is planning. But the European Union is run by a vast network of lobbyists who serve international financiers. And they're the people who make the decisions which are then carried out by the institutions of the European Union, such as the unelected European Commission. In France, for example, you have Francois Fillion, who is now going to be one of the major presidential candidates for the elections next year. He was asked by another presidential candidate, Philippe de Villiers, a very distinguished French diplomat, why he attended secret meetings with foreign potentates, foreign oligarchs of the finance world, such as the Bilderberg Group, for example. And his response was, well, it's because they rule. So here you have a presidential candidate who has admitted to another presidential candidate that if he's elected, he won't be the person running France. So that's essentially where the problem lies. You have international oligarchs who are accountable to nobody, who make the policies that are then carried out by the government. And the media's role is to obfuscate that, to distract from it, to disinform the public, misinform the public, and spread propaganda which serves the interests of their paymasters. And so this is a big problem. Do you have an informed electorate in Britain? I would say that the people who do their own research in Britain are very well informed. Those who rely on the corporate press have no idea what's going on. So they would not be capable of solving the kind of complex problems we're facing, such as the disintegration of the European Union, the mass immigration into the European Union that is now out of control. You have various NGOs such as the MOAS, for example, the Migrant Offshore Aid Station, linked to Blackwater and the US military, bringing illegal immigrants into Europe. Nobody seems to know or care about it.
Okay.
You have a vast network of NGOs involved in the foreign wars being waged by NATO against the populations of Syria and Yemen. And this is being replicated right throughout the Southern Hemisphere. So I think that to answer your question briefly, no, the British public, I don't think, will not have a say in what happens with Brexit, but they should have, of course.
Right. Sean O'Grady, I saw your reactions were so many, I lost count. One part you said no, but then it went into another level as Gearóid Colmáin was talking about his idea and ideas behind this. Go ahead.
Well, the whole thing about democracy in Europe and the West, America for that matter, if you will, is that it's not perfect. Nobody says it's perfect, but as Winston Churchill once said, democracy is better than all the other possible forms of government. It's the least bad one for all of its faults, in theory and in practice. And when it comes to the Europeans, and the British in particular, we have democracy, we have elections. They deliver uncomfortable, inconvenient results for the very finance lobby people that my fellow guest has talked about. In Britain, millions and millions of people, I can't remember how many millions of people actually, 40 million people were eligible to vote. Anyway, we had tens of millions of people voted in a European referendum on the 23rd of June. And they were influenced by the press, they were influenced by the television, and one of the biggest influences in the British media is the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, which is not a corporate body. At any rate, they made their minds up. They know their minds. They made their minds up that they wanted to leave the European Union. The row that we're having in Britain at the moment is really about democracy. It's about the nature of the way this debate is being run, whether Parliament's going to have a bigger or a smaller role, whether people are going to have another vote on it in due course when the terms of exit are negotiated and agreed. This is what it's about. The stuff about NATO being involved in Syria, the people who are doing the bombing in Syria right now, so far as I know, are the Russians with the Syrian government. Now, that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but that's where that is, right? The Americans are not really involved in that, despite various initiatives to have American-Russian cooperation on that. But that's another issue. That's way ahead from where we are, the European Union. So the answer is that, yes, there is democracy in Europe. Democracy in Europe is creating a lot of, as I say, inconvenient and unstable situations in a lot of countries. It's been doing that for a little while, just like it did with the Trump election in the United States. And 2017, as I say, we'll see elections in the Netherlands, it will see elections in France, it will see elections in Germany, and maybe Italy as well. These are big powers. In fact, they were all founding members of the European Union in 1957, on I think the 25th, 26th of March, 1957. 60 years old next spring, the European Union. They were founding members of it. All those countries' electorates will have a vote. We don't know what's going to happen. It's not fixed. There are many political parties for them to choose from, and a lot of the choices that they make, as I say, are not the ones that international finance or the Americans or the CIA or any of these other shadowy organizations would wish them to take. People make their own minds up.
Well, one thing that's going on, I know you have a response, Gearóid Colmáin, to Sean O'Grady, but one thing that is evident, and I'd like you to explain to us, is when you take a look at the broad picture across Europe, I could name certain countries like Italy. You have the North and the South, big divide. The South is practically, I mean, they are just economically down the drain. There are roughly in Europe about 20 or 25 regions that are looking for independence. The growing inequality is pretty glaringly in the face of everyone. It's pretty evident. And there are some that have come out and said, you know what, based on, again, Gearóid, Colmáin, some of the statements that you made, that perhaps they're letting Europe go to be divided between the ones that want to control the rich parts and then the rest that are not doing well, to let them go. So that pretty much would lead to a breakup of little areas all over the place. Is that one way of looking at it? Based again on what you have said, I took some of these examples and fit it into your perspective.
Well, if you look at the Freddie Heinigen map for Europe, I think it was referred to as, it was a pamphlet that was written many decades ago on a project or a plan or an outline for a plan of regionalization in Europe. You have all of the nation states basically broken up into smaller regions. And you do have independence movements in Europe, like obviously Scotland, you have Catalonia, you have in France increasingly Brittany. And this, this sort of attempt to rewrite history to make people believe that in France the problem is Paris and not Brussels, Washington, and the international finance system. The problem is incompetent politicians in Paris. But that's really only part of the problem. And again, it's a distraction. Regionalization of Europe is really about breaking up the ability of nation states to govern. Again, I agree with your guest to a certain extent that what exists in the European Union, even though it contradicts what I said, I should qualify what I said. The European Union is formally, I mean, most European states are formally democracies. But you only get a right to vote for policies between different factions of the oligarchy. And in Britain, for example, in Brexit, it was, to a certain extent, a victory for the people, the fact that they said no and their voice was heard. And there was a lot of popular support for Brexit. But one must understand as well that one section of the oligarchy in Britain was for Brexit. The Queen and other oligarchs, people like Rupert Murdoch and so on, they were for Brexit too. So it's not as if the kind of the economic policies are going to change for the better for the working people because of Brexit. In fact, privatizations will continue on a massive scale as they are in Britain, and so you will have a further erosion of what is left of the gains of the last century, since children were working in factories in the 19th century, and we have a return to that. And this is now there are of course differences, and again you've mentioned a few countries in Europe. So just to recap, regionalization is a big problem. It is happening, and I think that as the European Union breaks up in terms of the unity of the European Union with Brexit, you will have further regionalization, parts breaking off, and so on. And the question is, will that lead to more democracy or less democracy? It will certainly be presented as more democracy. If you listen to the independence activists in Scotland, well, the big problem is London. The big problem isn't London. It's an entire system. It's an entire economic policy that is the problem. So again, this is divide and conquer tactics, really, regionalization. Mm-hmm. Now, to come back to Italy. Italy has been a country that since Mani Puliti, which was a anti-corruption campaign in the 80s, 70s and 80s in Italy, which was heavily infiltrated by the Americans, which was very much a prototype of what happened in Brazil recently. An anti-corruption campaign, which is essentially about deepening corruption in the system and weakening the nation state. Italy, since the Mani Puliti years and the years of the NATO false flag bombing campaigns, has been very much a broken country, the very fragile state in Italy. It's only existed since the 19th century, and it is a country where there's a lot of regional identity. Independence movement, of course, again in Venice. Massive demographic problems, absolute population deficit in parts of Italy. So Italy is a country that has no sovereignty, and recently in the Italian press there was a scandal about the government, which basically said to foreign investors, come to Italy, our engineers are the cheapest in Western Europe.
Okay.
And these are the kind of governments we have. They're pimping out the nations to foreign investors.
Yeah, we're quickly running out of time. I got to jump in. I do apologize, Colmáin. Well, since you're talking about Italy, Sean O'Grady, quickly. Italy is the #3 economy in Europe. But now with the Prime Minister Matteo Renzi to resign, it remains on shaky grounds, and many are saying that it's going to be a downward spiral, and that may pull the European Union down. We know that the banks in Italy overall have problems. And then looking at the European banks as a whole, they're in the hole $1.3 trillion worth of bad loans. What I'm getting at here is Europe in big trouble when it comes to their debt, when it comes to banks, especially when you have this, Mario Draghi doesn't want to call it QE, but he's pumping all this money. What is it doing for the economy?
Right, well, in very simple terms, the Italian economy is in a bad way. The Italian government is, with the constitutional changes that the people rejected, is in a much weaker position to do anything about it. The banks in Italy, many of them are basically bust. They're insolvent. To refinance them is probably beyond the means of the Italian state, and the Italian state actually relies on the Italian domestic banks to buy its treasury bonds to finance its activities. So Italy is going bust. The question is whether the Germans and the rest of the European Union is prepared to prop up Italy, to bail it out, and to give it the money to keep going, just as we did for Greece. But as you say, Italy is a much bigger country with a much bigger banking. Well, they're propping up Greece.
Germany has destroyed Greece. How can you say it's propping up Greece?
Because they've lent them a lot of money in
Germany
order to keep Greece and the Greek banks going. If they had not done that, the Greek economy would be in an even worse state than it is in today. The point is that for Greece and for Italy and some other countries and some other banking systems, there is an enormous crisis going on. And that has damaged democracy, I would agree with that. But there is an enormous financial crisis that could spill over in all sorts of unpredictable ways in terms of the politics of the European Union. And the big question is whether Italy is too big to fail, because the consequences are terrible, but is it too big to save? Is the political willpower in Germany there to save it? Is the money there in Germany and other countries to save Italy?
Okay, I'll give 30 seconds to John Colmáin. Sorry, Sean O'Grady. John Colmáin, 30 seconds in ending here. Yeah.
Well, first of all, no, Germany's not going to save anyone. German investors are going to save themselves, and they're doing that in Greece by essentially robbing the country blind, and the country is dying. So the big fear in Europe among the countries that are heavily in debt, like France, where 95%, 97% almost of GDP now in debt, is that Germany will intervene, because if they impose those kind of draconian measures on France, the state will collapse. And Italy, of course, will collapse as well. So this whole idea of Germany propping people up is a myth. Germany is really the problem right now. It's the European Central Bank and this whole mythology about solidarity, which is a lie. I mean, these economies are being strangled by international investors, and of course the press never talk about that because, well, their job is not to talk about it.
Okay, we're going to have to end there. Thank you.
Well, I'm talking about it right now. So I'm in the press
no, you're
in
not.
Britain.
No, you're not. You're obfuscating as usual.
I'm sitting in low. Just
no, you're not. You're
the
defending
office.
them.
And
you do a good job defending them. I
read
the articles in your journal. You do a good job defending the foreign wars. I just heard you tonight.
I got to jump in now. Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. Thank you.
Nobody's reading you anymore.
Thank you very much. We're going to continue this hopefully at another debate. But thank you, political analyst and journalist Colmáin there from Paris, and thank you, Sean O'Grady, finance editor of The Independent. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kaveh Tafway, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran. Goodbye.